A German officer presses a loaded pistol to an American sergeant's forehead. Behind the sergeant stand 1,275 men, all of them potential witnesses to an execution, all of them moments away from possible death themselves. The officer demands to know where the Jews are. The sergeant, staring into the barrel of the gun, speaks 5 words that will either save 200 lives or end them all. This is the story of what happened when one American officer decided that courage was not optional, that solidarity was not negotiable, and that some truths were worth dying for. January 27, 1945. Stalag 9A, Bad Orb, Germany. The morning air cut like a blade through the lungs, sharp, bitter, carrying the stench of unwashed bodies, rotting wood, and something else, something metallic and final that prisoners learn to recognize but never name. Master Sergeant Roddie Edmonds stood in the pre-dawn darkness of the barracks, his breath forming small clouds that dissolved into nothing. His hands, calloused and steady, rested on the rough pine of a bunk frame. Beneath his fingertips, he could feel the grain of the wood, each ridge carved by some German carpenter who perhaps had sons now freezing on the Eastern Front. Around him 1,275 American soldiers slept the fractured sleep of captive men, a sleep interrupted by cold, hunger, and the particular terror of not knowing which morning might be your last. Tomorrow, the Commandant had ordered, only the Jews would fall out for roll call. Edmonds had received the directive just hours earlier, delivered by a Wehrmacht sergeant whose eyes never quite met his own. Nur die Juden. Morgen früh, 6 Uhr. Only the Jews. Tomorrow morning, 6 o'clock. No explanation, no paperwork. Just the order, hanging in the air between them like smoke from a crematorium chimney. Now, in the darkness, Edmonds ran his thumb along the edge of his dog tags. The metal was warm from his body heat, smooth from 2 years of handling. Name, rank, serial number, religion, Methodist. The Geneva Convention said that's all he had to give. Name, rank, serial number. Nothing about which of his men would die tomorrow. Nothing about how to save 200 souls with only 3 words. He had already made his decision. In that moment between receiving the order and this moment now, somewhere in the space where a man's conscience meets his conception of duty, Roddie Edmonds had decided that if one man must stand, then all men would stand. The path to Stalag 9A had begun 6 weeks earlier in the frozen forests of Belgium, during those desperate days when Hitler's armies lunged westward in one final furious attempt to split the Allied lines. The Americans called it the Battle of the Bulge, though the men who fought there knew it by other names. The freezing, the starving, the place where friends died in snow that turned pink and then simply disappeared beneath more snow. Edmonds and his men, part of the 106th Infantry Division, had been among those caught in the German assault. For days they fought a retreating action through villages whose names they couldn't pronounce, past frozen corpses stacked like cordwood, through artillery barrages that turned the forest into a nightmare of splintered trees and screaming metal. On December 23, 1944, near the Belgian village of Schoenberg, they had finally been surrounded. The surrender had come not with a bang, but with a whimper, with the quiet realization that ammunition was gone, that relief was not coming, that the choice was between raising hands or raising corpses. 7,000 Americans surrendered that day. Roddie Edmonds, the highest-ranking non-commissioned officer in his sector, had marched into captivity at the head of his men, his shoulders straight despite the German rifles at his back. The march to Germany took 5 days. 90 miles through winter, cold that turned spit to ice before it hit the ground. Through villages where German civilians watched with expressions ranging from pity to contempt. Through checkpoints where guards counted and recounted their prize of American prisoners. Men fell and did not rise. Others fell and were kicked until they did rise, only to fall again farther down the road. Edmonds learned during those 5 days that leadership in captivity was different from leadership in combat. In combat, you led men towards something, an objective, a victory, a purpose. In captivity, you led men away from something, away from despair, away from surrender of the spirit, away from the slow dissolution of self that came when a man decided he was already dead. Stalag 9A squatted in a valley near Bad Orb like a wound in the earth. Barbed wire, guard towers, barracks that might once have been painted but now showed only raw wood and rust. It had been built to hold 5,000 men and now held closer to 8,000, a number that swelled daily as more prisoners arrived from the Western Front. The German guards themselves looked half-starved, old men and boys mostly. The cream of the Wehrmacht long since bled away in Russia. But hungry guards were sometimes more dangerous than well-fed ones, Edmonds knew. Desperation made men unpredictable. Upon arrival, the prisoners were processed with Germanic efficiency despite the chaos of overcrowding. Names recorded, dog tags inspected, possessions confiscated. The Jewish soldiers were marked in the records with a discreet notation, a small J beside their names, invisible to them but noted with careful precision by clerks who understood that such lists might later prove useful. Edmonds was assigned command of his section, 1,275 Americans, a number he memorized immediately and checked obsessively at every roll call. 1,275 faces, 1,275 names. 1,275 mothers somewhere who prayed for sons they might never see again, among them approximately 200 Jews. Brooklyn Jews with accents thick as pastrami. Midwest Jews whose parents had fled pogroms to find safety in places like Iowa and Kansas. Southern Jews who spoke with drawls and ate grits and were as American as anyone. They were privates and corporals and technicians. They were medics and riflemen and radio operators. They were Goldbergs and Cohens and Steins, who bled the same red as the Smiths and Johnsons and Whites. The winter of 1944 bled into 1945 with the kind of cold that didn't just chill the body, but invaded the soul. In Stalag 9A, men learned the hierarchy of suffering. First came hunger, the gnawing, constant companion that turned dreams into feasts and waking hours into calculations of calories. The daily ration was a joke, a slice of black bread that tasted of sawdust, a thin soup that might contain a potato if you were lucky, occasionally a sliver of margarine or a spoonful of jam. Red Cross parcels came irregularly, and when they came, they were distributed with a stinginess that suggested the guards understood that controlling food meant controlling men. After hunger came cold. The barracks were unheated save for a single stove that produced more smoke than warmth. Men slept in bunks stacked 3 high, pressing together for heat, wearing every piece of clothing they owned. Frostbite claimed toes and fingers. Pneumonia claimed lives. The Americans learned to sleep in shifts so that the movement of bodies changing places generated precious seconds of warmth. After cold came boredom, the slow, grinding monotony that eroded the spirit more surely than any physical deprivation. Days blurred together. Morning roll call, endless hours with nothing to do, evening roll call, sleep. Some men made chessboards from scraps of wood and carved pieces from stolen buttons. Others organized classes, teaching each other French or mathematics or philosophy, though concentration was difficult when the mind kept circling back to food. A few went quietly mad, retreating into silence or babbling conversations with absent friends. And beneath all of this, threading through every moment like a bass note beneath a melody, was fear. Fear of disease. Fear of random violence from guards. Fear of the war ending badly. Of the Germans deciding that feeding prisoners was less important than a last desperate stand. And for the Jewish soldiers, a fear more specific and more terrible. Fear that someone would notice, would check records, would compile lists. They had heard rumors, of course. Even in the filtered, censored news that reached prisoners, even in the whispers passed from camp to camp through networks of prisoners transferred between facilities, the rumors came. Camps in the East that weren't prisoner of war camps at all, places with names like Auschwitz and Treblinka, gas chambers, crematoria, numbers so large they became meaningless, hundreds of thousands, Millions, entire populations erased. Most Americans didn't believe the rumors, couldn't believe them. The human mind has limits to what it can accept, boundaries beyond which information simply cannot be processed. Jews dying in work camps from disease and malnutrition. This was believable. This matched what they knew of war and cruelty. But industrial murder, systematic extermination, death factories with the efficiency of Ford Motor Company, this broke the machinery of comprehension. The Jewish soldiers in Stalag 9A lived in a peculiar limbo. They wore the same uniforms as everyone else. They stood in the same roll calls. They ate the same rancid soup. The Geneva Convention protected them, in theory. They were American soldiers, prisoners of war entitled to specific treatment under international law. The small J in the German records was just a notation, just information. Nothing to worry about. Probably, Edmonds worried. As senior NCO, he had responsibilities that extended beyond his own survival. He attended meetings with the camp commandant, Hauptmann Ludwig Brecher, a career officer in his 50s, whose Iron Cross from the First World War hung incongruously over a uniform that fit poorly on his thinning frame. Brecher was not a monster from central casting. He spoke English with a formal correctness learned from textbooks. He professed respect for American soldiers and claimed to be merely following regulations. But Edmonds had learned to read the silences between words, the things not said. And in Brecher's careful avoidance of certain topics, in his slight hesitation when discussing policies regarding different categories of prisoners, Edmonds heard the shape of danger. On January 26, the danger took definite form. Brecher had summoned Edmonds to the commandant's office, a drafty room in the administrative building that smelled of mildew and ersatz coffee. The commandant sat behind a desk empty except for a single folder. He did not invite Edmonds to sit. "Master Sergeant," Brecher began, his English precise but his accent thick. "Tomorrow morning at 0600 hours, you will order all Jewish personnel in your section to fall out separately for roll call. Only the Jews. The others remain in barracks." The words landed like stones in still water, each one rippling outward. Edmonds kept his face neutral, his voice level. "Why, sir?" Brecher's expression flickered, annoyance, perhaps, or discomfort. "This is not your concern. These are orders from above. You will comply." Under the Geneva Convention is not relevant to internal camp procedures. Brecher's voice hardened. "You will give the order to your men. Tomorrow, 0600. Dismissed." Edmonds had walked back to the barracks through twilight the color of a bruise. Around him, the camp went through its evening routine, guards changing shifts, prisoners shuffling to latrines, smoke rising from the cookhouse where tomorrow's bread was being baked from God knows what. Everything normal, everything routine, everything about to break. He didn't sleep that night. Instead, he sat on his bunk and thought about the mathematics of courage. 200 Jewish soldiers, give or take. The Germans wanted to separate them. Why? The question answered itself. No one separated Jews for good reasons in 1945 Germany. Separation meant selection. Selection meant death, quick or slow, but death nonetheless. Option 1, obey the order, identify the Jewish soldiers, watch them marched away, live with that forever. Option 2, refuse the order, be shot immediately, leave the 1,275 men without their senior NCO, leave the Jewish soldiers to be identified anyway, perhaps from records or informants, or the simple expedient of examining every man. Option 3, something else, something that hadn't been tried, something that might work, or might get everyone killed. Edmonds thought about his childhood in Tennessee, about Sunday school lessons delivered in a small Baptist church that smelled of lemon polish and old hymnals. He thought about the parable of the Good Samaritan, about the commandment to love thy neighbor. He thought about Abraham arguing with God over Sodom, demanding that the righteous be spared. How many righteous men would it take to save a city? 50, 40, 10. How many righteous men would it take to save 200 Jews? 1,275. The answer came to him not as a thunderbolt, but as a quiet certainty. a knowledge that settled into his bones like cold or hunger, something that simply was, requiring no further justification. If they wanted Jews, they would get nothing but Jews. Every American in his section would be Jewish tomorrow, every single one. It was insane. It was impossible. It violated every principle of self-preservation. It demanded that over 1,000 men risk execution for 200 strangers. Or not strangers, brothers. But still, could he ask that? Did he have the right? But command, Edmonds understood, sometimes meant not asking. Sometimes it meant deciding and accepting the consequences. He was responsible for 1,275 souls. All of them. Not selectively. Not the ones who were easy to save. All of them. He spent the remaining hours before dawn moving quietly through the barracks, shaking awake the squad leaders, the corporals, the men who had proven themselves steady. He told them what would happen in the morning. He told them what he needed them to do. He watched their faces in the darkness. Shock first, then calculation, then something like understanding, or perhaps just trust. Perhaps they simply trusted that their senior NCO knew what he was doing, even when what he was doing appeared to be leading them all to execution. "Spread the word," Edmonds whispered. "Quietly. Everyone assembles in full formation. Everyone. Tell them it's an order. Tell them—" He paused, searching for words. "Tell them we're all in this together. All of us." Morning came the way mornings come in winter, reluctantly, the darkness yielding to gray without ever quite achieving light. The thermometer mounted outside the guardhouse read -12 Celsius. The ground was frozen iron. Breath turned to fog, fog to ice. At 5:45 in the morning, Edmonds walked through the barracks one final time. Men were already awake, already dressing in layers against the cold. The word had spread. Everyone knew. The air vibrated with a peculiar tension, fear and determination mixed in equal measure. "Form up outside," Edmonds said quietly. "Full formation, company by company, squad by squad, everyone." They moved like ghosts in the pre-dawn, filing out into the frozen assembly ground. 1,275 men finding their places in ranks that stretched across the compound. The Jewish soldiers among them looked pale, terrified, resigned. They had heard rumors of what happened when Jews were separated from other prisoners. They had imagined this moment. Now it was here. But they were not alone. To their left and right, in front and behind, stood the Johnsons and the O'Briens and the Kowalskis, the farm boys from Nebraska and factory workers from Detroit, the Baptists and Catholics, and men who believed in nothing but their buddies. 1,275 Americans standing in the cold, waiting. Edmonds took his position at the front, facing the barracks area where Brecher and his guards were emerging. The Commandant stopped when he saw the formation. His mouth tightened. He walked forward deliberately, his boots crunching on frozen ground. "Master Sergeant Edmonds," Brecher called out, his voice carrying across the silence. "I gave you an order. Only the Jewish soldiers were to fall out." Edmonds stood at attention, his face expressionless. Behind him, he could feel the formation like a physical presence, the weight of 1,275 men who had chosen to stand. "They are fallen out, sir," Edmonds replied, his Tennessee accent thick in the cold air. Brecher's face reddened. He strode forward until he was face to face with Edmonds. "Do not play games with me, Sergeant. Where are the Jews?" The moment stretched. Somewhere a guard coughed. Somewhere a raven called from the watchtower. The sun, still below the horizon, painted the eastern sky the color of blood. Edmonds looked directly into Brecher's eyes. When he spoke, his voice was clear, calm, absolutely certain. "We are all Jews here." 5 words, 5 simple words that redrew the boundaries of possible. 5 words that made 1,275 men into targets. 5 words that bet everything, every life in the formation, including his own, on the proposition that courage could be contagious, that solidarity could be stronger than self-preservation, that a German officer standing in a frozen prison camp in a collapsing Reich might blink first. Brecher's hand dropped to his holster. He drew his Luger, a P08, 9mm, 8 rounds in the magazine, 1 potentially in the chamber. Edmonds had seen men killed with such pistols, had seen the entrance wounds, small and neat, and the exit wounds, catastrophic. At this range, Brecher couldn't miss. The Commandant raised the pistol and pressed it against Edmonds's forehead. The metal was cold enough to burn. Edmonds did not move, did not flinch. His eyes stayed locked on Brecher's. "They cannot all be Jews." Brecher's voice cracked, fury and frustration and something else, perhaps fear of his own, breaking through the Prussian discipline. "We are all Jews here," Edmonds repeated. Then, his voice still calm, still steady, he added, "As the senior non-commissioned officer, I am required by the Geneva Convention to give only my name, rank, and serial number, nothing more. And I should tell you, Hauptmann, that if you shoot me, you will be prosecuted for war crimes when this war is over, which we both know will be soon." The last sentence hung in the air like a verdict, because it was true. Every man in the camp knew it was true. The Russians were crushing toward Berlin from the east. The British and Americans were crushing from the west. Germany was dying. The question was no longer whether Germany would lose, but whether individual Germans would survive the losing. Behind the formation, absolute silence, 1,275 men not breathing, not moving, watching their senior NCO with a gun pressed to his skull. Some of them were certainly praying. Some were certainly terrified. Some were certainly wondering if they were about to die for a principle they had never particularly thought about before this morning, but none of them moved. None of them broke ranks. They had been asked to stand, and they stood. Brecher's hand trembled slightly. The barrel of the Luger wavered against Edmonds's forehead, just millimeters, but enough. Edmonds saw the calculation happening behind the German's eyes, the cost-benefit analysis of a dying regime. Kill one American sergeant, trigger what consequences, and for what? Orders from above, yes, but above was fragmenting, communications were breaking down, and when the war ended, when, not if, there would be tribunals, there would be justice, there would be reckoning. The moment lasted an eternity, lasted 5 seconds, lasted both simultaneously in the strange dilation that happens when death stands close enough to taste. Then Brecher lowered the pistol. He holstered it with shaking hands. His face had gone from red to white, sweat freezing on his temples despite the cold. He looked at Edmonds, then at the formation behind him, at the sea of American faces, implacable, immovable. "Return to barracks," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "All of you. Return to barracks." He turned and walked away, his stride stiff, mechanical, the walk of a man who has looked into an abyss and stepped back from the edge. His guards followed, casting uncertain glances at the Americans who stood motionless in formation. It was only after Brecher disappeared into the administrative building that Edmonds allowed himself to breathe. His legs felt liquid. His hands, when he looked at them, were shaking. But his voice, when he spoke, was steady. "Dismissed. Return to barracks. Maintain order." The formation dissolved slowly, men moving like sleepwalkers, the enormity of what had just happened settling over them like snow. They had stood. They had faced down execution. They had won, if you could call it winning when the prize was simply living another day. Back in the barracks, men sat on bunks and stared at nothing. Some cried. Some laughed hysterically. Some simply sat in silence, processing the fact that they were still alive. The Jewish soldiers moved among the others, shaking hands, embracing, unable to find words adequate to what had been done for them. What do you say to someone who literally put his life on the line for yours? Thank you seemed insufficient, yet it was all they had. "You didn't have to do that," one of them said to Edmonds, a private named Shapiro from Brooklyn, whose voice still held the rhythms of Williamsburg. Edmonds looked at him, exhausted, still shaking slightly from adrenaline. "Yes," he said simply, "we did. The war ground on for another 3.5 months. The Russians reached Berlin. Hitler committed suicide in his bunker. Germany surrendered unconditionally. On May 7, 1945, the guns finally fell silent across Europe. American forces liberated Stalag 9A on April 4th. The prisoners watched from behind wire as tanks rolled up, as soldiers in clean uniforms and well-fed faces stared at the skeletal scarecrows that had once been men. The liberators brought food, real food, chocolate and white bread and meat, which the prisoners devoured until they vomited, their bodies unable to process richness after months of starvation. Brecher was arrested. Edmonds never learned what happened to him in the chaos of post-war justice, whether he was prosecuted, imprisoned, or simply sent home to try to rebuild a life in the ruins of the Reich. Edmonds never tried to find out. The 200 Jewish soldiers, or rather the 183 who survived the remaining months of captivity, returned to America. They scattered across the country to Brooklyn and Iowa and Kansas, to jobs and families and futures they had not been certain they would have. They married and had children. They became accountants and teachers and businessmen. They lived ordinary lives made possible by an extraordinary morning. And they never forgot. But Roddie Edmonds forgot, or seemed to. He returned to Tennessee to his wife Roxy and his son Chris. He worked as a salesman. He attended church on Sundays. He became a deacon. He coached his son's baseball team. He lived a quiet life, remarkable only for its ordinariness. He never spoke about the stand at Stalag 9A, never mentioned it to his wife, never told his son. When other veterans gathered to share war stories, he sat quietly, listening, contributing little. It was as if that morning in January 1945 had happened to someone else in some other life. Perhaps for him it had been simply duty. Perhaps he genuinely did not see himself as having done anything extraordinary. He had been responsible for 1,275 men. He had kept them safe. That was his job. The fact that doing his job required facing down execution, required gambling 1,275 lives on a bluff, required 5 words that redrew the boundaries of courage. Perhaps all of this seemed to him merely the ordinary cost of leadership. Or perhaps he understood something deeper, that true heroism doesn't demand recognition, that the most profound moral acts are done not for acclaim, but because in that moment, in that place, with those stakes, you could do nothing else. Roddie Edmonds died in December 1985 at the age of 69. His obituary in the local paper mentioned his military service briefly. Served in World War II, captured, liberated, returned home. 4 sentences to encompass 3 years of his life, one of which contained an act that would ripple forward through generations. It was only after his death, while sorting through his father's effects, that Chris Edmonds discovered the truth. A former soldier from the camp wrote a letter. Then another. Men Chris had never heard of contacted him, telling him stories about his father that seemed to describe a stranger. They spoke of mourning in January. They spoke of 5 words. They spoke of 1,275 men who stood because one man asked them to stand. Chris began researching. He contacted veterans. He filed requests for military records. He slowly pieced together what his father had never told him, that Roddie Edmonds had performed one of the most remarkable acts of moral courage in American military history, and then gone home and sold insurance and coached Little League and never mentioned it once. In 2015, 70 years after that frozen morning, Yad Vashem, Israel's Holocaust memorial, began investigating Edmonds' case. They interviewed survivors. They reviewed records. They documented the evidence with the same meticulous care that they brought to all investigations of those who had rescued Jews during the Holocaust. On December 10, 2015, Yad Vashem announced that Master Sergeant Roddie Edmonds would be recognized as righteous among the nations, the first American soldier to receive this honor. The award is given only to non-Jews who risked their lives to save Jews during the Holocaust. It is the highest honor Israel can bestow on non-Jews. Chris Edmonds traveled to Jerusalem to receive the medal on his father's behalf. He stood in the Hall of Remembrance at Yad Vashem, surrounded by survivors and their descendants, men and women who existed because one morning in January 1945, a sergeant from Tennessee had decided that if one man must stand, then all men would stand. "We are all Jews here," Chris repeated, his voice echoing in the hall. 5 words his father had spoken once and never repeated. 5 words that had saved 200 lives. 5 words that had rippled forward through time, through marriages and children and grandchildren, through careers and contributions, and ordinary miracles of ordinary people living ordinary lives that would not have been lived at all except for those 5 words. The story of Roddie Edmonds raises questions that have no easy answers. What makes one man capable of such courage when others would understandably choose self-preservation? Is moral heroism innate or learned? Can we train people to stand up in the face of execution, or does that capacity emerge only in the moment, unpredictable, inexplicable? Perhaps the answer lies not in Edmonds alone, but in what he understood about the men behind him. He knew them, knew their fears and strengths, knew they were ordinary men capable of extraordinary things if someone showed them what was possible. He didn't ask them to be heroes. He simply asked them to stand. And they stood, because he asked, because he stood first, because courage can indeed be contagious. Or perhaps the answer lies in something simpler. In the fundamental recognition that we are all Jews here was not metaphor, but truth. Not in the religious sense, but in the human sense. We are all vulnerable. We are all capable of being targeted. We are all diminished when some among us are selected for death based on categories invented by ideologies of hatred. The Holocaust killed 6 million Jews and millions of others: Roma, disabled people, political dissidents, gay men, Soviet prisoners of war, Jehovah's Witnesses. The industrial machinery of genocide sorted and selected, categorized and marked, separated and destroyed. It depended on cooperation, on the willingness of ordinary people to distinguish between us and them, between those who must be protected and those who could be sacrificed. Edmonds and his men refused that distinction. For one morning in one frozen prison camp, 1,275 Americans said no to selection. No to categorization, no to the logic that would save some at the cost of others. They said, we are all Jews here. They said, you cannot take any of us without taking all of us. They said, our lives are bound together and cannot be separated. And because they stood together, because they refused to allow some to be designated as disposable, 200 men lived who otherwise would have died. 200 men who went on to father children and build lives and contribute to the tapestry of human existence. Their descendants number in the thousands now, teachers and doctors and artists and ordinary people living ordinary lives, each of them an echo of that morning when 1,275 Americans stood in the cold and refused to let hatred win. Roddie Edmonds never spoke of that morning, never sought recognition, never claimed to be a hero. He understood what modern America sometimes forgets: that heroism is not about acclaim, but about action, that the most important moral acts are often performed in obscurity, that you don't stand up because history is watching. You stand up because standing up is right and sitting down is wrong. And in the space between those two truths, there is no room for calculation or compromise. We are all Jews here. 5 words. 5 simple words that contained within them an entire philosophy of human solidarity. They echo still, across the decades, asking each generation, when the moment comes, when authority demands selection, when ideology requires categorization, when expedience suggests sacrifice, will you have the courage to say that simple, dangerous, liberating truth? We are all Jews here. We are all vulnerable. We are all connected. We all stand together, or we all fall alone. Master Sergeant Roddie Edmonds understood this, and on a frozen morning in January 1945, he bet everything on the possibility that 1,275 ordinary men would understand it too. They did. They stood. And that made all the difference.